Fantastic, fantastic, Ash, and welcome everyone to this show. I'm just going to show you now what we're going to be talking about today, which is most of these topics just here and a little bit more as well. Now, I will tell you that today is kind of a follow-on from session 1. This is session 5. It's kind of a deeper dive based on the things that we talked about in session 1. If you haven't seen session 1 yet, it's not a bad idea. And there is a link in the chat there that Ash has provided for you where you can see all of the webinars, but most importantly, in this case, is number 1. So you might want to see that first. If you have seen that already, who knows, you might even want to see it again. So these are the things we're going to talk about today. I just want to go over a couple of definitions because sometimes we have and I might just turn off my camera because not everyone wants to see me, I don't think. So a few definitions, because sometimes what we do is we talk about these things as if everyone knows exactly what we're talking about. A few basic ones in RMS, with the generic term for a room is an area. I use the phrase room, but you might have apartment sites, cabins, villas, whatever. I'm going to call them rooms. It's all the same thing. Same with categories. It's called categories in RMS, but I call them room types, but it could be apartment types, cabin types, whatever. OTA, amazing how many people ask me what that is. An OTA is an online travel agent, and it includes things like Booking.com, Expedia, etc. But I'm also including in, if you're involved in a chain or a brand and you feed out price and inventory from RMS to their online booking engine, I'm looping that in as an OTA as well. We'll talk a lot today about derived rates, which is a new rate based on an existing rate, and we'll talk about how important that is. And dynamic pricing is the ability to automatically adjust rate based on occupancy triggers. So as you reach a predefined occupancy level, the rate will change depending on how you want it to. So there's a few of the things that we're going to talk about and some definitions. We're going to come back a little bit later and have a look at some of these diagrams. But here we go. All right, so we're going to start off in the channel management area and talk about loading online travel agents. So I'm here in the left-hand side. I'm going to setup and I'm going down to online bookings. I will warn you, I'm going to talk very fast because there's a lot to talk about and I'll be darting all over the place. So you may want to come back to the recording and just quietly go through it again. I'm going to go to channel management. Now, we can't talk a great deal about how to hook up OTAs because every single one of them is a little bit different. And the most difficult and time-consuming part of the whole thing is actually opening the account with the OTA and uploading your images, descriptions, all that sort of stuff. But we're not going to talk about that so much today. If you did want to connect one, you would go up the top here where it's referring to status. You'd be looking for unconnected, and here they all are, lots and lots of them. But today we're going to pretend I just connected to Booking.com, which I did. I've got a test version here we're going to have a look at. So I'm going to double click on there and we're going to go and have a look at the Booking.com setup. There's a couple of things that I want to show you here. Every OTA is different. With Booking.com, all you really need to do is put in your hotel ID and that's enough to connect. I'm just going to go down the bottom now to have a look at our room mapping. So what would happen, you would set all your room types up in, say, Booking.com. And look, I'm going to keep referring to Booking.com because it's the one I know the best, and I've got a real example of it here, but it's the same for all of them. In this particular case, we're going to create all of our room types in the OTA, and they will all be here on the left-hand side. We've actually only got one room type here, which we're going to talk about. So in the OTA in Booking.com, we called it a standard double room, and that would have been a terminology that Booking.com are happy with, but it might not be what we call them in RMS. So we now have to link that. So we'd say, yeah, well, that's what we call one of these, let's say, and then we would, from the drop-down list, add the rate type we're going to use. Now, I'm based on session 1 when we talked about bar multi and the ways that we manage the rates using that system. It's the only system I talk about now. So we're going to assume that you're on board with that, and the rate type you would be putting in here would be one of the derived rates you've created that comes off bar multi. We'll talk about that in more detail in just a moment. but I would say, for instance, this is my OTA rate, which is a derived rate of my bar multi. You'll see that we've got the same room type here twice because one is a special, one is not. So I would have the same apartment type here, but it would be a different rate type. So this would be, for either a deal or a, different rate, different whatever. The main thing to understand is that you can't have the same combination, these three elements combined. You can't have the same combination more than once. So that's one thing to remember there. I just want to talk about availability now. There are three ways to provide availability to an OTA or the IBE, the Internet Booking Engine. Let's have a look at them here. It is do not use allotments. In other words, you've got full availability. You're not holding back anything. You're saying that the OTA has access to everything. And I've got to say right up front, that is really the one I recommend. 20 years ago, maybe not so much because we'd had issues with double bookings and things like that. The technology is so refined now, you don't have to be nervous about it. You can certainly open up the full allotment. The next one is default allotment, and I'm just going to very, very quickly go to default allotments. To find that, I'm just going to type in default, and there they are. This is an opportunity to create an allotment that you can be used variously amongst all the different OTAs and the IBE. It's just a matter of, and I'm not even going to do it, it's just a matter of one at a time, choosing the room types that you want to make available. You would probably make this as set permanently, and you'll notice in this particular case, I have 3 of those rooms. I might want to put in here 3, I might want to put in 2, or I might want to put in 1. It's completely up to you. And that allotment can be used again and again. But as I say, I don't necessarily recommend that. The other one that you can do, you can say, I want a channel allotment. When I click on channel allotment, you'll see it now gives me another button up here, channel allotment, and then I can put in an allotment once again. I think this is a little bit unnecessary. So that's about all I really want to show you today in the channel management section and connecting OTAs, etc., etc. As I say, unfortunately, it is just a matter of going through the process and using the help documentation, etc., etc. And of course, our support team's always more than happy to help you with that. I am just going to go back into setup again, and I'm going to show you one other thing that you might, in terms of availability, take opportunity to use. And if I go into online options, so I was in setup, online bookings, now I'm going to online options. You can see there's a lot of information here. We're going to have a separate webinar all about the Internet Booking Engine, the RMS Booking Engine. You can see there's a lot to talk about. It would take a whole session, but the one thing that I do want to talk about here today is in the room type setup. And you can see you do have the opportunity to hold back some rooms from online. So if you are just a little bit nervous about having all of your availability and you want to hold back the last 1, 2, or 3, you can put a number in here and it will be the last room that will be held back. It's a little bit different to allotments. You could have an allotment, and if the house sold the first 2 or 3 rooms, then the last room would go to the OTA. If that's not what you want to do, then this is where you solve that problem. Okay, so now we're going to go to the control panel, this is more what I'd rather talk about today, and we're going to add a restriction. So I probably did that a little bit fast. I'm just going to go back and do it again. I've got a little icon up here for control panel. You can also get to it via the rate manager. There's my little icon. If you haven't got that and you want to put it in there, here's the setup area here where you can customize what icons go in that top bar. But here's mine. I'm going to click on it now, and I'm going to add one by clicking the little add button here. Lots of restrictions that you can do, and we're going to spend a lot of time on that in another webinar. Today, we're just going to talk about allotments. Now, OTAs are great, but I'll tell you this thing, there's two two groups of people in the world. There are the people who, just live and die by OTAs, and that's sort of where they get the majority of their business, and they think it's fantastic, and they really embrace them. The other group of people in the world are those who are not so, mad about OTAs and would rather get direct bookings. And I'm just going to show you a couple of things that you can do here that might help you do that. One thing about OTAs is that they work very hard to get the loyalty of the customer. So where they should be loyal to your hotel brand, they're loyal to the OTA. So OTAs do have the ability to sort of book your rooms fairly quickly, often quicker than you. They can book that, months in advance in times when you're going to be busy anyway. You could have filled the place 3 times, but it's full of OTA bookings. As we all know, with the very generous cancellation policies that most of them have, these people are sitting in their lounge room making dozens of bookings all around the place, and then at the last minute they decide where they want to stay and cancel the rest. Really painful. So there's a couple of things you could do. We showed before how we're setting the allotment that we are making available to the OTA. But what we can do, we can change that allotment in bulk in this screen here. We might change that allotment to 0. So we might turn it off completely. And we might say, well, let's do that when we get to, say, I don't know, I'm just making up a number now. Let's change the allotment to 0 when we get to 70%. So, we're pretty confident that the last 30% we can sell on our own. That's one way you might want to do it. And just remember the fact that we talked about occupancies in terms of percentages, because I want to go on to the other side of that. The one that I have used with a lot of properties that I work with and our own little family business is this one, where it's nights from today. And I'm just going to tell a little history story here now, and the older folks in the room will know all this, but the younger ones might not. When most of the OTAs started sort of 20 odd years ago, they were a method of selling distressed inventory. I love that term, distressed. It sounds so positive. And it was, the leftover rooms we had. And I'll talk about one called an OTA called What If, which was the first one I ever heard of 20 years ago, and very successful in Australia. And what used to happen is the inner city hotels used to have empty rooms on weekends. So they would use What If to sell these rooms, this distressed inventory, and people from the suburbs would come and stay in rooms that were normally $400 a night and would stay on the weekends for $100. It was fantastic. Everyone won out of this situation. And What If only showed, believe it or not, 7 days of inventory in advance, and the technology limited it to that. After a while, big breakthrough, it went to 14 days and 28 days, and here we are, where the world is run by OTAs, and it's 24 hours a day, every day of the year. But if you wanted to turn your OTAs back into just distressed inventory, and as I said, I have done this, what we did was turned our allotments, to 0 after 7 nights from today. So in other words, if you went to any of our OTAs on the 8th day, it would say there's nothing available. Now, the first group of people in the world are just horrified that you'd ever do that. Why would you ever turn off the tap, this lucrative tap that's filling our hotels? But believe me, there are a lot of people who would think this is a great idea. And I'd love to see in the comments anyone who would use that and who would think that's a good idea. But anyway, that's one way of just controlling your OTAs a little bit. All right, so we've talked about all of that. Now, we just mentioned occupancy before. And what does occupancy mean? Like when we talk about occupancy, what is that based on? Well, I'm going to go into setup, and I'm going to go down to property options and property information. You may have more than one property here, so just choose the one you want to edit. I've only got one, so I'm going to go into this one. I'm going to go all the way down to options, and there's a couple of things I want to show you here. So see this dynamic pricing and restrictions. So when we're talking about changing rates or setting rates or changing restrictions based on the current occupancy, it can be calculated in various ways. One, by the property. Now, let's say you've got a property and you've got 100 rooms and everyone's exactly the same. That might really suit you. And what that would mean is that if you had 90 rooms booked and 10 left, you were running at 90% occupancy. More importantly, if you had 85 rooms, it would be 85%. So you would see that the more rooms you have and the more they are the same, the more incremental control you have. So you might say, yeah, I want that to be property. On the other hand, you might say, well, I've got lots of categories, lots of room types, and they're all different. And, it doesn't always sort of work the same way a property would. So you might want to change that to room type. So there's two options that we might talk about. And I'm going to just go and show you one other thing before we move on from this screen. And you'll see this top one here, and it says this top option. And it says include rooms with maintenance reservations as available for occupancy calculations. What that means is this. Let's say you have 10 rooms and 9 of them are booked and you have one out for maintenance. It's going to say, in this case, that you have 100% occupancy. So, and this will have an effect on calculating those occupancy rates. And it's also, this is a side issue, but it's important. If you happen to own a property and you have managers and you're rewarding those managers on the basis of occupancy, you want to make sure you've got this setting right, because it would be very easy to just add maintenance bookings to increase your notional occupancy level. So one to think of. Now, the problem with room type and or property is that very few properties that I've ever been involved with, that I've ever worked with, have that very straightforward, I've got 100 rooms, they're all the same, or I've got lots of room types that are, got lots of different rooms. Because imagine if you had a room type that had two rooms in it. Dynamic pricing isn't going to work for you because you're either 50%, 100%, or zero. You're never going to be able to use those, 85% and all that sort of stuff. So one thing that you can do, and I'm going to go back to my little diagram now, is have groups of rooms and groups of room types for the purpose of calculating occupancy. Let's have a look at this property here, and this property here has 3 different types of room types, and it has 2 car parks. Now, if we use the property option to calculate occupancy, and it's going to be out, isn't it? Because we've got all these car parks that we're using in RMS, but it's sort of throwing us out because, we don't really care if the car parks are full or empty. We don't want to use that to affect the occupancy and therefore the rate of our room type. So property's not going to work. In this particular case, I happen to know there's only 2 deluxe rooms. So once again, using room type as the method of calculation also isn't really going to work. What we need to do is group some of our room types. So what I've done is I've said all of these room types here, I'm going to call them rooms, and it will be the combined occupancy of all of the room types that will give us our occupancy percentage. And the same deal over here, I've grouped the car parks, or I could have left car parks out of it altogether. Let's go and see how you would do this. So once again, I'm going to be in setup over here. I'm going to go to room type rooms, and you can see that here's all my room types listed from top to bottom. And you can see in the right hand column, I've got one called grouping, and I've named each one of my room types in a particular grouping. Let me show you where I would create those names. I'm going back into lookup tables. I'm going to go all the way down to grouping. And you can see that I've got, one grouping of room types called cabins, one called sites. If I wanted to create a new one, I could say, I'll click the little add symbol up there. This is going to be a room type grouping, and I can call it whatever I like, car parks or whatever. This can also be, if you've got a holiday park type situation where you have roofed accommodation and sites, this is a great way of splitting up the grouping. You might have a property that has lots of tourist accommodation, but residents, once again, residents would throw out your figures. So this is not a bad way to do it. Once we've done all of that, we're back in our room types again. I know I'm going fast. I know I'm talking fast, and I know, it's a complex issue. It'll all make sense as we go through. And I think the important thing is, you'll get the recording, just go through it, playback, repeat, blah, blah, blah. Let's have a look at this room type here. You can see that I've grouped this room type. So I've said this is one of our, this type of accommodation is a cabin. But look down here, I've got one called dynamic pricing grouping. So I might call that a cabin as well. So now every one of these room types that I want to group together for the purpose of this exercise, I'm going to call a cabin. I'm not going to save that, I'll just move on. So I hope that made sense. Now we've looked at all of that. No, so in session 1, we talked a lot about bar multi and setting rates and all that sort of stuff, but we did gloss over a few things. So now I want to go into the rate manager again. Here I am. I'm going to go to the rate section over here, the rate button icon thing here, and I'm going to go down to rate tables. Now let's quickly talk about the different types of setups we can have. You'll see that I just clicked on add. I'll do it again just so you saw what I did. I'm in the rate table section. I'm clicking on add. And you can see one of the first questions to ask is, what is the structure? Is it an OTA rate or is it a direct rate? And you can see that if it is a direct rate, I have all of a sudden lots more options, different sorts of things that I can do. But here's the problem. If you use a direct rate, the chances are it's not going to work on most of your OTAs. Lots more options, but it won't work on your OTAs. So my advice to you is this: if you sort of stuck in the olden days and you're never ever going to have any inventory online anywhere at all, never going to have an OTA, never going to join a chain, never going to do any of that stuff, sure, use the direct rates. The rest of us, you're going to be much safer if you use the OTA structure. Let's have a look at one. I'll just go to this top one here that I've spent a little bit of time on as a good example. I'm going to edit this one now. So starting at the top, and you can see that on the right-hand side, here is what I'm charging for each day of the week. And I've got a person base here of 2. That means that I'm charging $88 a night for one person or 2 people. If I wanted to have a single rate, I would change this to 1, and additionals, which we'll go and have a look at in a minute. The first additional would be the second person, and that's how we would get our 2-person rate. But if you want a single rate, that person base needs to be 1. I'm going to leave it as 2. A couple of other things to see here. We can put mins and max in here. I wouldn't do that here. I'll show you where I would do that. Little thing we'll talk about in a minute, cancellation policy. We can choose a cancellation policy for a rate table. Once again, I wouldn't put it here, but you can. Next thing we're going to have a look at is packages. You can add all sorts of packages. Just be careful if it gets too complicated. Some of the OTAs won't handle it, but most will handle most. I'm just going to have a look at this one for a moment. This is one we set up to cover the extra cleaning for a one night. So we've said, well, we're going to, regardless of the booking, we're going to charge $5 for each adult, $5 for each child, etc., etc. A few other things you can look at here. If this is something to do with housekeeping, you might want to show it on the housekeeping report. If it is something that, somebody has to do, you might want to show it on the to-do chart. You might want to show it on the account, usually not. And down the bottom here is when you're going to charge it. Maybe it's going to be, every day, maybe on the first day. You'll see here I've got include and exclude on the first day, include and exclude on the last day. You wouldn't charge for dinner on the last day. You wouldn't charge for breakfast on the first day. So that's how that all works. So packages, very advanced. You can do just about whatever you want with those. Let's go down to deposits. Once again, you can set up very intricate deposit rules here. I wouldn't do it here in the rate table. I'll show you where I would do it. But if, for some specific reason you want to do it here, yes, you could do it here as well. Let's have a look at additionals. So we've got our base rate. So that was in our example here, was going to cover the first 2 people, but we might have more scope to accommodate more people. And here we can say how much we're going to charge for extra people. You can see we've got first, second, third, fourth. Let's say in this case, by the time you get to the 3rd person, which makes 5 people, maybe you've got to bring in some sort of, roll-away bed or something. So maybe that person would be more expensive, for example. We could charge for lots of things on a daily basis. I've put here infants, pets, but there's another 7 that you can put in there. And maybe you want to charge for an extra boat or grandmothers or whatever you would like to charge on a per person basis. Once again, unbelievably flexible. Remember that we are at the moment in a rate table. This is like the basic building block of the rate system. Whether you would adjust housekeeping rules here, I probably wouldn't, but you could. If you don't change anything here, it's just going to go straight back to the global housekeeping settings that you put in at the start when you first set up RMS, but you can have things that are a little bit different. For example, if this is the cheapskate rate, you might disclude midweek services or something like that. If it's the super deluxe rate, you might want to add in a few housekeeping features. Once again, I know I'm saying this a lot, wouldn't do it here. I'll show you where you would. This is one you might like to use. Let's say your property is near the airport and, the early Singapore flight gets in at 7 a.m. and you've got people rocking up at 9 a.m. and they want to check in. If you have rooms available, you might want to allow those people to check in, but you might want to charge them for that. I won't go through the detail of how you do it. It's pretty self-explanatory. If you set this up, all you have to do is check the person in at that time and it will automatically make those charges on the account. You can have an early check-in fee or a late checkout fee. Once again, very automatic. You might want to use that. Similarly, a no-show fee. So you might want to say, well, I'm going to charge the first night if nobody turns up and you don't give the sufficient notification. You've still got to go in and sort of send them the bill or charge their credit card or whatever, but at least it will put it on the account for you. Bonds, for those folks that use bonds, it's just a matter of choosing the refundable charge. And an audit trail here to see what people have done in changing all of these things. Let's have a little look now. I'm going to go back to rate setup. Let's have a little look at dynamic pricing. Very easy to set up. And, it can be a little bit fiddly, but remember, and if you watch session 1 again, you'll remember that we can set up templates of rate tables. You don't have to fill this thing in every single time with every single field. You can set up a template and just use it over and over again. What we've said here, and by default, between 0 and 100%, we're going to charge, if we look over here, $88 plus all of the additionals that we've put in, etc. Where we haven't set up something specific, it's going to fall back to that default rate. But I have, in fact, put in lots of occupancy brackets where it's going to change the rate, and it covers everything from 20% to 100%. So, until we get to 20%, it's going to charge this default rate. And then from 20% to 30, it's going to charge bar 2, 31 to 40, bar 4, etc., etc. Now, let's just have a look if we were setting one from scratch. So I've just clicked on the little occupancy one and I'm clicking add. You can see it's just a matter of putting in a bracket. It can be whatever you want. Once again, if you're using room type, and you've only got 3 or 4, what's the point of even doing this? Because you can't get into your 37% to 66% or anything like that. It's going to be 25, 50, whatever. But in this case, we can put in whatever occupancy bracket we like. An easy way, if you want to, you can just say, yeah, well, look, I just want to add, 10% or something like that. You could do that. What we talked about in session 1, and it's still the way I recommend, is to use an existing rate. And in this case, it would be just a simple matter of choosing one of the other bars. And you would imagine that you're going to choose a higher bar, the higher the occupancy is. That's how that works. I'm going to show you the time one. not a lot of people use the time one, but it is there. Let's say I wanted to edit this last occupancy bracket of 86 to 100%. I'm just going to click on there. I've highlighted that. Now I'm going to click on time and I'm going to add one. Now it all gets a little bit complex, and maybe this is not what you want to do up here, but what you could do, you could say, well, what about if 12 hours, and I'm just an example, it can be anything you want. Let's say it was 12 hours out until midnight. So 12 hours would be midday. And if you're one of those nervous Nellies, and there's two groups of people in the world, there's the group of people who just can't stand seeing an empty room and they would rather let it go for next to nothing, just cover the cleaning costs rather than have it empty. And there's the other group who, no, they want to, top dollar for the last room. If you are one of those folks who like to fill every room, you might do something like this. You might say, well, if we get to midday and the occupancy is still between 86 and 100, I want to, just panic and I want to drop it back to bar 2. You might want to do that. You might not, but at least now I've shown you how you could do that. All right, so that's some of the things that you can do with rate tables, just a little bit more than we talked about in session 1. The next thing I want to talk about is rate types. So I'm going to go here. I'm back into my rate icon. I'm going to rate types. Let's look first at my main rate types, and here they are. And if you think back to session 1, we set up all of our bars. We called our lowest bar auto, and we only put the dynamic pricing on auto. So if I set my bar, and I'll just move that. See, I've set this one to auto. So this one is just as the occupancy increases, it's only 3% at the moment, so it hasn't changed. But as the occupancy increases, so will the rate if this is set to auto. I've only set this up for budget rooms. That's why that's saying NA. Let's go back now to rate types. And what we could do. So I can use bar 2 and onward to be my manual override. So if I've selected auto as the bar rate, it's doing it automatically. If I want to override, and why would I do that? Because maybe it's, Easter's coming up or a long weekend or 4th of July, whatever. And I know I'm going to be busy. So I want to set that for the highest bar I possibly can. I don't want to wait for dynamic pricing to quietly ratchet up to the high rate. Let's click on the derived rate tab now and just have a look at a couple. And derived rates, we just got to talk about this for a sec. And I've got to say, one of my customers over in North America, Mike from Cove Communities, reached out and he said, look, I think there's a bug in the system. He said, I can't hide bar multi from the system. And he said, there are times where I don't want staff to see that. And as we go through this, you'll understand why. Now, the good news is that probably by the time that folks are watching this video on YouTube, that will have changed and you will be able to. And I'll just show you in a minute what I'm talking about. But when we don't really want to use bar multi as the rate we push out to the front desk or the OTAs or the IBE, because we don't have the opportunity to put all the inclusions and exclusions. It's really, bar multi is a system setting, if you like, which sets the rate, but now we want to use the derived rates to publish those rates to those various ways. Let's have a look at this one I've set up earlier. I've called it standard rate. And here we go. We're deriving this from bar multi. So it's saying, well, just take the bar multi rate, whatever that says, but we're going to call it something else. I've called it standard rate, so it makes a lot of sense to the front desk. I've put an asterisk in front of it, which is going to make sure that's always at the top of the list. But for the customer's point of view, and this is what's going to appear on invoices and receipts and online, I've called it best available rate. You could call it whatever you like, but that sounds a lot better than bar multi. I can also put in a long description. Let's talk about a few other things on this page before we move on. Here's one, advanced purchase rate. This might be one of the derived rates that you use. This might be one of the derived rates that you use to encourage people to make bookings with longer lead times. So we might say, well, this rate is only available for bookings 90 days out from today. It won't appear anywhere. No one will be able to see this. If you went in today, it would only appear for bookings in 90 days from now or more. and maybe that would be a cheaper rate. Or maybe you want to have a last minute rate. So you might say, and this is old standby rates. I don't know if people use these as much as they used to, but you might say, look, if you're walking off the floor and, I've got a room, guess what? I'm going to let you have it cheaper. Once again, if I put a 1 in there, it will only appear today. It won't be there tomorrow. A couple of things that you might want to use. Let's go over to the right-hand side now. Most of these self-explanatory, but let's go through them anyway. If I check contracted rate, this would only be a rate that I would use that I've negotiated with a travel agent or a company. The next one, if I've linked the database in RMS to an external source like a group or a chain or a brand, you would need to put in the member's number to have this rate appear. These are easy. Do we want to include additionals or packages in the adjustment that we're going to make? And I'll show you adjustments in just a sec. Set new min-max nights. Most times you're going to want to do this, so it wouldn't hurt to check that box. No discounts, it's obvious. Do not use it as a promo code. Yep, pretty obvious. Don't let it be overridden. This is one I always check, round to nearest dollar, because if you're using percentages to adjust the amount, you can get some pretty weird and wacky numbers. You don't want it to be $132.56. This bottom one, I don't even know if we still use ticks. For my North American friends, a tick is a check mark. I don't even know if we use that. Jenna might be able to answer that question. She's in the background listening to every word I say. So this is where we would set this up. Let's look at adjustment amounts. Now, in some cases, this may be a derived rate, and I want it to perfectly reflect whatever the bar multi rate is. If that was the case, I would go up to adjustment 1 and I would say adjust by an amount. I would leave it at 0. I would click this button over here, which is apply to all, and effectively every room type here would be exactly the same price as whatever the bar rate is. Why would you do that? For example, on the IBE, if you don't do this, if you don't set up a derived rate for the IB and you're using bar multi, it will show the bar rate for every one of the individual bars. So you have to do this, and perhaps you don't want to add any on or make it any cheaper. You want to make it the same. You'll see you can have 2 adjustments. This might occur. Let's say you're getting bookings from the GDS and you might want to adjust. You might want to add, say, 12% to accommodate for the commission, for the agent's commission, but you might also want to take the GDS fee, $12, whatever that is. So you could do that here as well. If you're dealing with an OTA, chances are you're going to want to add, a percentage, 12%, 15%, whatever you want, or even just anything, 5%, just to, soften the blow a little bit. You might want to set up a deal here. And for example, you might want to set up a crude stay 4, pay 3 deal. If that was the case, you would say, I want the adjustment to be minus percentage 25%. If that was the case, that might only run for a certain period of time. So rather than use the master rate periods, we would want to use an existing period, and we'd want to add one. We'd click the plus symbol here, and we would want to add an ad hoc period, give it a name, something you understand, and for a period of time, a week, a month, whatever, and then that rate will only be available for that ad hoc period. I hope that's making sense. I know I'm going fast, a lot of stuff to talk about. Let's go through, is that everything? I think it is. Audit trail, you can see every change we've made. Deposits. Now, this is somewhere you might do deposits, and bear in mind you can do a global deposit rule for the entire property, but see, you just might want to have different deposit rules depending on how much people are paying. So once again, if this is an OTA rate, maybe that's got a deposit rule. If it's the booking engine, maybe a different rule, and if it's whatever, another rule again. So this is where you might consider setting up your deposit rules. It's all pretty obvious, and for your peak periods, maybe you take 100%. Maybe for your off peak, maybe just the first night, maybe nothing. So you can do all that there. We've been in the derived rate setup. We know what's going on there. Some extra details, just the only one I want to show you. Look, again, we can set up a cancellation policy here specific to this derived rate type. I'll skip over taxes. Housekeeping, once again, you might do this here. You might say in the rate type, I want to have an extra task that is performed from a house pointing perspective, or maybe, less. Maybe they're not paying much, so they're not going to get much. This is the min max nights we talked about. That crude stay 4, pay 3. You might want to have a minimum of 4, maximum of 4 if you wanted to do that. Packages, we can add packages in here. Property rate rules, once again, we can set up rules here. I won't go through them all. Chances are, if you're using property rules, you know about this already. It's probably a very important part of your business to have this. The one thing I will show you, once again, is cancellation policies can be selected there. So now I've talked about cancellation policies a lot. Let's go, we're back over here, look up tables, but I'll just do the little talk first. With cancellation policies and cancellation fees, and I noticed that talking to some of the bigger groups and bigger operators, that the cancellation fees have actually become a significant line item in some profit and loss statements and balance sheets, etc., etc. And you can even fish for cancellations if you want to. So if you had different cancellation fees, you might say, well, I've got a rate, and we talked about those advance rates before. You might say, well, look, I've got this, you've got to book 90 days ahead. It's a very, very cheap rate, but we take 100% up front. And if you cancel, doesn't matter when you cancel, you're going to lose the whole lot. And, there would be people out there who would say, oh, this is a great deal. Look how inexpensive it is. 90 days out, who knows where you're going to be, what you're going to do, you could have COVID, whatever. So, it is a way of, it's another form of income if you want to use it that way. The other side of it is you might have periods of the year, I'm thinking of in our industry, Christmas and Easter, very, very busy. You could sell every room 100 times over. We have a very, very strict cancellation period for that. In the middle of the year, you could set off a cannon, not hurt anybody. We might have a very relaxed cancellation policy, or if I'm charging a lot of money, I might have a relaxed. How do I do all this? Let's have a look. We're going to go down here in lookup tables. I'm going to show you again, lookup tables. We're going to go all the way down to, what are we talking about? Cancellation policies. And I can just put in as many as I like. You could literally have a dozen cancellation policies if you wanted to. And I've shown you some of the places that you can set up a cancellation policy. The last place I'm going to show you where you can do that is in a reservation. So you might say, well, here I am in this reservation, and I've cut somebody a really good deal, and I'm going to set up the cancellation policy here through my drop-down list, and I'm going to, give them the no refund one because it was such a good rate. So lots of places to do a cancellation policy. What would be the good of that? Where would that work? Well, in correspondence, when you're setting up your form letters, and we'll just have a real super quick look at this. Let's say we were adding a new form letter. We would come in. What did I hit then? If I was setting up a new form letter, I don't want to save that. And I was clicking this one here, and you'll see that if I go to the merged table of reservation, I'll find one here, which is somewhere down here, which will be cancellation policy. And so any correspondence that you send out can include that cancellation policy field. Also, if you make a booking on the IBE, it will also reflect the correct cancellation policy. I will tell you, however, there is an hierarchy, and one can override another. So the lowest one is rate type. If you set up a cancellation policy in the rate type, it can be overridden by just about everything else. If you want to use multiple cancellation policies, the safest place is in the rate type property rule. It can only be overridden by a cancellation policy in the reservation. Now, Ash, if you're still there, that's all I have to say about all of those things, but open for any questions that might be there.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Dave. You did cram a lot in that session, so I do encourage everyone to go back and have a watch once we send out the recording in the next couple of days. It was very insightful. Thanks, Dave. So if anyone has any questions around the topic today, can you please drop them in the chat and we'll try and answer a couple. So
The one thing I would say, and what really helps us to put together a good show, is if we know what people are looking for. And so, if you can comments, you're going to get a survey after this thing. If you can just give us some feedback, is it too much detail, not enough detail? Are there certain topics you want to talk about? Be fantastic if you could share that with us, and we'll try and sculpture these sessions to cover the sort of things that you want to see. Excellent. No worries. Fantastic. Thanks for coming along, folks. I just love the fact that, and there's a lot of people turned up today. I can tell you, I'm just looking at the attendance figures. So that's fantastic. Thank you very much.
Great. You're fantastic. Thank you, everyone.